This is a copy of an anonymous threatening letter that was sent to a church in the United Kingdom. The news reported that 15 such churches have received letters. This is the only one the media had published and the only one I'm analyzing. And our purpose in analyzing an anonymous threatening letter is, first of all, to assess the threat. What is the threat? How strong is the threat? How likely is the subject or the author to carry out the threat? Secondly, we like to attempt to identify the writer. In identifying an anonymous author, we look for about a 70% rate of success. In other words, if we give 10 descriptions of the author and we're only right on 60 or 70% of them, the recipient is very likely to be able to identify who it was that wrote that letter and sent that letter. We don't have anywhere near 100% accuracy in this psycholinguistic profile, but 60-70% is very high and usually good enough to identify for police, for the recipient, who wrote and who sent the letter. So take a look at this one first, and then we'll talk about some of the things that we can draw from it. Now, please note that, and I'll post this on the blog, the statement analysis blog, that my lettering is not the author's lettering. This is a little bit different. Stop all your services straight away. If you don't, your church will be petrobombed while in service. Continue behind closed doors, and your congregation members will be stabbed one by one. Blood on your hands. You have been warned. The first thing we notice in an anonymous threatening letter and we take into consideration is a very strict context. The analysis is only legitimate, only applicable at the time of the writing and or mailing of the letter. In other words, it is a very narrow context. What we're going to do is analyze this author's verbalized perception of the threat, but it's only at the time he either wrote it and he sent it. Here's why. If we look at a very strong threat, a linguistically very strong threat, the analysis is only good for the time it's written or sent, because anything can change. So let's say someone wrote a very strong threat and they're going to carry it out. That's their intention. That's their linguistic commitment. 2 days later, they were arrested. This changed everything. And it goes for the opposite as well. If someone has a very weak threat, and we're able to conclude this is a very weak threat, this subject, this author, is not likely to carry it out, something could change between the time of the analysis and an actual event that would take place that could mean a threat carried out. The number one trigger for this is some form of humiliation. So it could be anything from the death of a loved one, loss of a job, a mental health breakdown, a physical health breakdown, any type of crisis in their life. But in particular, if that author, who may be sitting on the fence with a rather weak linguistic commitment, is humiliated, especially by either the recipient or someone like the recipient, it suddenly goes from, on a scale of 1 to 10, a 1 or 2, very low, to an 8 or 9. Humiliation, psychological humiliation, bruises deeply, and that can change everything. So we look at the priority of the threat, we look at the linguistic commitment to the threat, and we go from there onto a psycholinguistic profile. A psycholinguistic profile is where our language reveals us, who we are, what our interests are, what our background is, what our experiences may be, but also the priority. Stop all your services straight away. So the first thing I notice is that this is the priority. This author wants to stop church services. It comes right from the very beginning. That's what the author wants. If you don't your church will be petrobombed. We now have a conditional threat. There's two things you should learn about a conditional threat. Number one, the author is willing to not carry it out on a certain condition. If you stop this, I won't do that. That sort of thing. So it's a conditional threat. And the second thing is, the author allows for the recipient, in this case a church, to control the danger of the threat to petrobomb the church. So there are two elements there of control that are yielded. And if the church stops, the implication is that they will not be petrobombed. He is willing for them not to suffer, and it's in the church's hands. Yet he himself is willing to back down. We take this context and we move into our second area, looking for linguistic commitment. Stop all your services or I will firebomb you. And that's not what he said. That's me putting a subject in psychologically to a commitment. I will firebomb your church. I will, petrobomb your church. A little bit different language in the UK than the United States here. We probably would use immediately versus straight away, and we would say gas bombed or Molotov cocktail or that sort of thing, fire bombed. The author removes himself from the responsibility of carrying out the petrobomb. That makes it a weaker threat. He's not in it. If someone says, you stop your services or I will petrobomb you, that's much stronger, even though it has a condition to it. So we take the condition and then we move to the author who's allowing for himself to bail out of this. If they do what I say, I don't have to do this. Yet, he's not saying that he's going to do it. Now, this is only one of 15 letters, and so it's just the only analysis is this letter at the time of writing or mailing, not the other letters, which things may have changed. It's this particular recipient, this particular author at this particular time. He allows for the conditional, and he removes himself from making the threat. You'll notice that the pronoun I is not anywhere. It doesn't start, which meaning there's no psychological presence. Remember, we're not dealing with reality. We're dealing with the author's verbalized perception of reality. It's a big difference. When I do this type of work, and generally most of it is for law enforcement, although there are some for private corporations, I always recommend that an analyst never work alone. That he should have at least two other professional analysts. One of them, I believe, should be a female. As male and female speak and process differently, the influence of language is very important to discern whether the author is a male or female. Others who may be a little more pressed, especially those in law enforcement, what they can do is to analyze a particular anonymous threat and then have others review their work. But it should always include at least one male and one female analyst. I always say three or more to best discern. What happens is we begin to form an opinion, and it's difficult to back away from that opinion. This human nature itself. Someone else may have a contrary opinion, which is invaluable to the work, and we invite that. Also, we notice that not only is there not a psychological commitment, but there's more here. This will be only while in service. Continue behind closed doors. The author is telling us something about what I believe to be a male here. And I believe it is about the male sexuality. So what I would look for in this is I wouldn't be taken away to automatically assume like an Islamic terrorist here with the stabbed. Your congregation members will be stabbed one by one, blood on your hands. Whose blood? He doesn't tell us. This is a further affirmation of the weak commitment with the missing pronoun I. He doesn't tell us whose blood. blood on your hands, and we call this a passive voice, not the grammatical term of a passive voice, but where someone begins with a level of distance that becomes like a passive type of threat, but stays in it. He's not moving into a voice that is consistent in it. So, I will stab your members one by one would be very strong. I will stab your members. You do this, or I will stab your members. He doesn't say that. Your members will be stabbed. One by one would indicate a sense of control. Now, some of you that are familiar with statement analysis will recognize that doors can be related, I'll make a mark here, can be related to sexual abuse. And this should be understood also in context, is that what we're saying is not that the author was sexually abused, but it should be explored for. It should be explored for. And when we look at doors, it can make sense psychologically, and usually having to do with childhood, where a door will enter the language unnecessarily. If there's a necessity for it, then it's not an indication of possible sexual abuse. And you think about it, a child who is traumatized by sexual abuse may have a recall of the sound of a door opening, and then horror begins. A horror that may suppress the immune system, that may bring PTSD symptoms for the rest of the child's life. So the consequences are severe. It often enters the language of victims, and so we look for it. Continue behind closed doors. This is a concealing of the author's identity, or an attempt to, often related to sexual activity. You'll be stabbed, and it's one by one. In other words, the author is claiming some form of control where everyone will have to wait their turn to be stabbed. This tells us very likely that the author has an intense hatred and also a need to control. And that sounds like a victim of childhood abuse. Their blood will be on your hands. No, just blood will be on your hands. We don't know whose blood specifically. You have been warned. By whom? He doesn't say. In looking at this, I believe that they may, and I don't know, but I believe that the author may be, and law enforcement may discover, that this is a person whose sexuality is front and center, and he may either be a victim of early childhood sexual abuse related to the church, not this particular church, but the church in general, the Christian church, or he may be someone who was offended by church doctrine. Now, people of faith, Christianity and Judaism, teach contrary to sexual autonomy, that human beings do not have a right to have sex any way or anyhow they wish to. The Christian ideology and the Jewish ideology is that sexual relations are between a man and woman under the covenant of marriage, and everything outside of that is a transgression. This now culturally has become very popular, where Christians and Jews can be claimed to be bigoted for having this opinion. And you see the intolerance as it goes back and forth, but it becomes like a trendy, and it may fade again and tolerance may return. But right now, the author may feel supported by political correctness in this sense. But the author is angry. This could be Islamic terror of someone in the same vein, or it could be a type of masking. I don't know, where the author would like to not get caught, so let me blame a Muslim, for example. Also, at least the news reports from London of the incessant stabbing that goes on, that could enter the language as well. The author very likely has a need to come out from behind a closed door. Authors are crying out. If the author was, for example, sexually molested by a Roman Catholic priest, in Roman Catholicism, child molestation is against the ideology. So an offender has to act against their own ideology. This could be someone who may have experienced sexual abuse at the hands of someone within the church or at home, which is the statistically more likely, of someone who presented as a person of faith, heightening the hypocrisy of someone that's going against the ideology. At the time this is written, the subject does not make a tangible threat against the church. At the time this is written, anything could change that. And so all precautions must be taken. But I believe they should be looking for a male, and during the interview process they should be exploring for the possibility of sexual abuse. And I think here it's probably a little stronger than the word possibility, but more of a probability. This is a bitterness, and the need to control a situation is often a result of trauma. Trauma is where one experiences something that's beyond their control. And so combined with the threat, how many threats end up having to do with sexuality, targeting a place of faith, this person likely is very offended at religious or people of faith ideology, but personally bruised and wounded by someone that the author associates with people of faith.